My name's Carrion-Murayari. I'm the Kraus Family Curator at the New Museum, and we're here for the next in our series of deep dives looking at exhibitions from the Museum's past through our digital archive. And today I'm very honored to be joined by Alfredo Jaar, whose exhibition 1+1+1 took place at the New Museum between January and April of 1992. So Alfredo, thank you so much for being with us today. And maybe just to start, can you talk a little bit about how the show came to be? You were very young at the time. I think you were not even 35 when the show originated at I believe, the La Jolla Museum of Contemporary Art.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, this was my first museum show in the United States that started in La Jolla, then went to San Jose, to Seattle, and then came to the New Museum. And for the New Museum, it was curated by Alice Young, a young curator that unfortunately passed away in a tragic accident, in a car accident on Canal Street.
yeah,
So,
she's sort of somebody who I know from a lot of artists who I talked to who've done shows at the New Museum in the 90s. She was a really beloved figure.
Absolutely. So in the end, the show became a kind of tribute to her, really. She was an extraordinary individual and a fantastic curator.
And the show originally, the originating curator was Madeleine Grynsztejn, of course, who's the
Exactly.
director of the MCA
Exactly.
Chicago. How did it feel? You were just a few years past having kind of had a breakout at the Venice Biennale in 1986. How did you, approach thinking about your first museum exhibition? It's not a tremendous amount of time, a body of work to be drawing on within, maybe your first 10 years of being an artist. What were your goals for the show? What were you trying to get across?
Good. I have to go back to 1982 when I moved to New York. I was escaping the dictatorship in Chile, and I was suffocating because of the repression, the censorship, and so on. So I got my architecture degree and I moved to New York. This was January 1982. And I never studied art. I'm an architect. So I went to work as an architect for 5 years, from 82 to 87, with a firm called SITE, S-I-T-E, founded by James Wines. And so during these 5 years, I had a double life. I was working as an architect during the day, and in the evenings and on weekends, I was an artist. And so as an architect, for me, context is everything. So I needed to understand the context of the New York art world before acting in it. So those 5 years gave me a chance to understand, to look around. So I became a kind of cultural anthropologist, where I started trying to understand. So I went to every museum exhibition in New York. I went to every gallery exhibition. I went to every lecture I could attend. I subscribed to every magazine I could afford. Basically, the idea was to acquire knowledge in order to act within that system. I wanted to understand the system of the art world in New York City. I want to remind you that the 80s were a very different time than it is today. It was not the globalized world that we have now. It was very, very close. An international exhibition at the time meant a few Americans and a few Germans. That was it. There was no space for artists from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, even from the rest of Europe. It was very close world. So during those 5 years, where I was trying to understand before acting in the art world, I discovered two things. First, that New York was definitely, at the time, not anymore, the center of the art world. It had extraordinary institutions with extraordinary programs and the most powerful galleries, the most powerful art press and media, and the most powerful machine that projected itself into the world and projected the artists from New York into the world, right? Creating an extraordinary unbalance with the rest of the world. It was not fair, it was not just, but this is the way it was. So that was an easy diagnostic. But the second one was that New York was extremely provincial. Provincial in a sense that artists were only Americans or Germans. So it was a very limited group of artists of just a couple of nationalities. Mm-hmm. And second, their work, the content of the work was incredibly self-referential. They were talking about themselves, looking at themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, okay, I got it. What should I do? And I gave myself a mission. I thought, okay, that's my niche. I'm going to attack this reality, this self-centered reality that ignores the rest of the world. At the time, there were maybe 27 conflicts around the world that you would never see them walking around galleries of museums. And I thought, okay, I'm going to bring the world to New York. That will be my strategy. So in '85, 3 years after arriving, I was doing what I do normally, which is read a lot of international press, trying to inform myself. This is part of my modus operandi. And I read about this gold mine in the eastern part of the Amazon in Brazil called Serra Pelada, where I read that 100,000 miners had left their homes and families and went to this gold mine. And it was a scene like hell. This was in 5 lines in a newspaper from France, no images. So I thought, that's interesting. I live near Wall Street. In Wall Street, they're dealing with gold. They have no idea what the reality of mining for gold is. It's very abstract. So perhaps I could make a balance between what's happening in that gold mine in Brazil and Wall Street in New York. So I applied for a Guggenheim Fellowship to go to Brazil to visit that gold mine. I was told, you're too young to apply for a fellowship from the Guggenheim, but try anyway. It's better that you will be rejected a few times and then eventually you will get it. I was very lucky. I got it immediately, at the first time. So with the money, I went to Brazil. I went to this gold mine. I took thousands of pictures. I interviewed the miners, and I came back to New York. And with this material, I did my first public intervention in New York, which was in the subway called Rush's in 1986, where I filled the entire subway station with the money from the Guggenheim. And I rented the entire subway station, 81 posters with images of the miners. And every 7 segments, I had the price of the gold in different world markets. So this was information that people going on the 6th line to downtown would understand because there were brokers going to Wall Street. So I wanted to show the reality of gold mining in Latin America. And so it was information brought to New York in a poetic way. So that first public project put me on the map. Madeleine Grynsztejn happened to be in New York, and she happened to go into that station subway because Soho was the center of the art world at the time, and she saw it. She has said herself, she was blown away, and she wanted to know who was the artist. By an extraordinary coincidence, I was there that morning surveying my work. We met, and then she curated her first show for 1990 at the La Jolla Museum where she was working. So that show had a lot of works from this series about gold in the morning, gold in Brazil, and it also contained other works, if I remember well, about another project I did also in the early 90s about the boat people in Vietnam, incarcerated in Hong Kong. So here I was from Chile, living in New York, bringing news from Latin American gold miners and from refugees from Hong Kong, refugees from Vietnam, incarcerated in Hong Kong. So that was my objective, bring news of the world in a poetic way as an artist to this very insular sea.
Do you
So
feel like
that was the framework in which I was thinking.
do you feel like by 92 in New York there was, spaces to have these kinds of discussions, to talk about these kinds of things? I think, for me, looking at the history of the New Museum, it really is like by the early 90s, really when the program starts to become much more international, when it starts to show, like for your show was such an important one, eventually, Dor Salcedo or Sildo Mieres, like, these artists, like that starts to happen at the New Museum in the early 90s. But in terms of like the New York art world at large, do you within that first decade of your career in New York, did it, or at least did you find, sympathy with other artists by that time?
It was incredibly close. I think the New Museum was an exception thanks to Marcia Tucker's vision.
Yeah.
She really wanted to break all the rules, and that was one way for her to break all the rules. It was unthinkable for an artist of my age and from my origin to have a show in any other museum in New York at the time. Unthinkable. Today, it's very easy. You are 30, you are from Africa, you are from Asia, you're from London, and you can have a show at the Guggenheim, which still sounds incredible, but this is possible.
Yeah.
But at the time, absolutely unthinkable.
And so, how did the show change? You had basically three different bodies of work that you were focusing on. The work about Brazil, the work about Vietnam, and I believe the third one was looking at what was the third one? On Africa. You were looking at Africa, at the Western investment in Africa, and the problems that we're creating. Did you feel like you needed to change the exhibition from the touring to New York, or did you feel like, it also was a very specific architecture, and that old space, the old New Museum space, on Broadway was a very particular kind of building, and your work is always really kind of, dealt with these images, but really through a spatial, experiential kind of dimension. How did you think about showing there in that particular venue?
Well, I was thinking like I always do, which is as an architect. So I wanted to play with the architecture of the space, and we did some design moves that were very important for me. For example, I was allowed to build walls that were tilted.
Yeah.
And because it was the objective of the show was to suggest the center cannot hold.
Yeah.
This old order is collapsing. And so everything said that. It was about the content of the work and the way it was installed, and it was about the architecture of the museum. Everything was a way to suggest all this.
And what was the sort of impact of the exhibition for you? I mean, in terms of just as you had done with the subway piece, were you very attentive to that audience experience in the space?
Yes, because I was totally unknown, so I went almost every day, talked to people. I didn't never introduce myself as the artist. No one knew what I looked like. So I was able to gather a lot of information, and I learned. This is a strategy that I've always used in order for me to learn as an artist, is to talk to my audience, to understand, to look at their body language in the space, how they move in the space, how they react to the work, how they interact with the work. And so it was a very beautiful learning experience.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll ask you about one of the pieces that I've always been struck by, which is it's the Fading version 2, which is one of the pieces about Vietnam. It's the sort of long trays with the blue light. Can you talk a little bit about how those images came to be and how you imagined that that structure, which is such a dramatic?
Yeah, I had gone to Hong Kong because I had read that Vietnamese refugees called boat people were incarcerated there in the thousands. There were more than 15,000 refugees there. And Hong Kong wanted, which was a British colony at the time, wanted to send them back to Vietnam. And the refugees had said that if they were forced to go back, they would commit collective suicide because they just didn't want to go back. So when I read that, I thought, I'm going. And so I want to document that reality. I visited all the refugee camps in Hong Kong. I interviewed refugees, and I wanted to understand the situation, which is a result of the Vietnam War, that Vietnam won, but the entire world boycotted Vietnam after winning the war.
Yeah.
And so the country could not grow because they didn't have a currency, they didn't have funds to grow as a country. And that provoked this famine, and people had to leave the country. So this was not in the news, because the news have a cycle where things happen and the next day they move on to something else. So Fading was about that, was about the fact that these are real lives being lost in this tragedy and that nobody cared. So I wanted to find a way to articulate that idea of not caring, of forgetting. And so that's why I put these photographs that I had taken myself in those refugee camps inside those trays with water. And the images were fading in real time during the exhibition. And I was thinking that perhaps if they fade too fast, I will replace them and put new ones. But they faded quite slowly, so I kept them on during the entire exhibition.
I think that's, I like that story because I think it does speak to, I think, you know, even some of the artists that we work with today who, you know, the piece is maybe not, you know, the way that the piece evolves may change through the exhibition, and your intentions may change through the exhibition, through, you know, that kind of openness to that, you know, material process, you know, that kind of experimentation still happening in the gallery, I think is a really special thing, I think, from that time, which is really amazing. And I mean, that story also resonated so much with me. I think it's, you know, that that you were both, you know, approaching the situation, you know, almost from a journalistic lens, but you were also having to navigate the experience of getting access to that site itself and to those people itself and bringing it back to New York. If I'm not correct, the place where they were kept is kind of on further out from the center of the city, I think. I can't remember the name of that neighborhood.
Yeah, they were in an area called Kowloon, which was on the other side of the water.
Yeah, which is now, you know, there's lots of art things that happen there now, but it's that I always thought about. The first times I went to Hong Kong, I thought a lot about that particular piece because of that history. Now it's almost forgotten.
Well, the main work from that series called Untitled Water, which was also in the exhibition at the museum, which 6 light boxes with images of the water on one side and images of the refugees on the other side being reflected on the mirrors, is in the collection of M+.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because when M+ was born, they wanted to create a comprehensive collection of Hong Kong art done in the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. And they realized that they had a hole in the 90s, and that no one from Hong Kong had dealt with this issue of the boat people. And they had seen my work somehow, as a curator, and then they decided to acquire that major installation for M+.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's such an interesting, you know, I've also been thinking a lot about this exhibition in the last few years, you know, even given the younger artists that I've been working with, you know, internationally, who, you know, make very different work than you, but some of these questions are still the same. So something like Hong Kong, you know, I think a lot of people may have, you know, especially in New York, forgotten about the Vietnamese boat people, you know, especially as Hong Kong has changed so dramatically. And then on the other hand, you know, something like, you know, the tragedy, like, and the, you know, the crimes of the, you know, Brazilian mining industry, you know, I know young artists working in Brazil today who are still, you know, dealing with these incidences that are still happening now. And of course, you know, the you know, the corruption and the destruction of, you know, capitalism within African, you know, context as well is, you know, incredibly still at the forefront, I think, of a lot of young African artists' minds. So, you know, I'm wondering, you know, when you look back at that show, are you, you know, are you surprised at how present that history still is, or, you know, how does it feel, you know, within this context of now 30 years later? How do you think about the work that you were doing then in the context of where we are in the world today?
Well, I just keep doing exactly the same thing. I'm always traveling around the world. Before COVID, I was traveling 200 days a year, because all my work respond to real life tragedies, and that's what I do. And you mentioned journalism. I am a kind of a frustrated journalist in a way, and I want to bring the news to the world, and I want to do it with poetry. And so that's what I do. Basically, I have been incapable in my entire career to create a single work of art that is just the product of my imagination. I just don't know how to do that. And I admire artists who sit on a table in front of a piece of paper or a blank canvas, and then they do something out of here. I just don't know how to do that. As an architect, for me, context is everything. And I have to respond to the context. And so that's what I do. So what I did in the 90s, I still do it today.
Well, maybe just to step out even a little further, what do you, aside from your own exhibition, do you have, memories of the New Museum at that time in the early 90s, of other shows that you saw, or, how it functioned, for artists of your generation? Because as I mentioned, I think that's really for me when I got excited. The New Museum was an institution I cared much about because of these shows, these international shows, and the sense of discovery and the sense of an openness to the world outside of New York, which I think we still try as much as possible to work with.
Well, of course, the New Museum has changed greatly in the last 20 years. It's another institution today.
Of course, yeah.
But at the time, the New Museum was quite unique. It was the institution that would take risk. This is how we identified the New Museum. Half of the time, we hated the exhibitions that happened there, but we applauded them at the same time because she had the guts, I'm talking about Marsha, to actually try new things. And she invited unknown artists, she invited marginal artists, she invited, peripheral artists. She took so many risks in of all kinds. And she was attacked from all sides for doing it. And as I said, it's not that I enjoyed every exhibition, I admired every exhibition, but I admired the spirit and I admired the vision. And I think that she was really following Beckett's line, which is fail and felt better. So she was always trying to feel better. This is how I identify the New Museum. Yeah. And it was a trip to go to the New Museum. It was really, what the hell is she going to come up with this time? What are we going to find? What are we going to see? So it was absolutely unique. There was nothing like this at the time, and there is nothing like this today, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. It was a different, yeah. I mean, it was with the, I think, closeness I'm sure that artists felt, just it being a smaller art world in New York at the time made such a difference that I'm sure the distance between, working on your own to the New Museum didn't feel so vast back at that period. Well, maybe just jump into the present a little bit, and obviously it's, especially for an artist who's, who depends so much upon context and being in context that, that challenge you and, open your eyes to things that are happening in the world. How are you working these days? Are there projects that are ongoing that you're thinking about and working about, and, of course, everything that's happened in the world in the last several months has in many ways illuminated a lot of things for people that maybe they didn't want to think about beforehand, because now they have the time and they're forced to look. So can you talk a little bit about what you've been thinking about?
Yeah, well, of course, I've been thinking about COVID and how it has revealed the reality of this country, how we are really facing more than one crisis. We are facing at least 3 or 4 crises: the health crisis, the financial crisis, a democratic crisis, and so on. All these things have been going on for quite a while, and they were invisible to a lot of people. And so now finally they're visible. So this gives us a chance to think. It's an opportunity. It's like an opening to rethink the entire system, because the art world is also a perfect reflection of the real world. So we have to rethink also the institutions and the way we think within the art world. It has been, of course, impossible to travel, so I have not traveled. And so in the studio, we are working on 4 major exhibitions that were planned for this year that have been all postponed for next year and further along. So we have work to do, but we are not able to create new works because I cannot travel. and travel and visiting the place in situ and reacting to it is a fundamental aspect of my work. So during this time, I've done that, and I've created a couple of videos to react to this crisis. And I've done them here at home in front of my computer. They're very modest, and they respond to the crisis in my own poetic way.
Well, that seems very exciting. You know, I don't want to keep much longer, but you know, I want to thank you for chatting with me. And I always learn so much from your work, and I have, you know, going back so many years. So it was like, it's still a very special moment in our history, and I hope people will take the time to dig in a little deeper to that exhibition and those bodies of work, because I think again, it's, you know, they have stayed so so urgent and so timely, and yeah, I think they're really, it really is a special moment in our history. So thank you, Alfredo.
Thank you very much. I'm honored for this conversation and by your words.
Yeah, and I look forward to, you know, hopefully not too long, being able to meet in person again. That'll be great.
I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.